Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Stull. That was terrific. Okay, it is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Ikerd. Dr. Ikerd is Professor Emeritus of Agricultural Economics at the University of Missouri. He was raised on a small dairy farm in southwest Missouri, and he received his BS, MS, and PhD degrees from the University of Missouri. He worked in private industry for a time with a large state universities in North Carolina, Oklahoma, and Georgia before retiring from the University of Missouri in early 2000. He spent the first half of his academic career as a livestock marketing specialist and the latter half on issues related to sustainable agriculture. Since retiring, he spends most of his time writing and speaking on issues related to the sustainability of agriculture. He currently resides in Fairfield, Iowa, with his wife Ellen, 2 dogs, and 3 cats. That must keep you busy, right? So over the past 20 years, Dr. Ikerd has met with community members concerned about concentrated animal feeding operations, or what in shorthand we call CAFOs. In 16 states he's done that, 4 Canadian provinces, and most recently in Wales of the United Kingdom. His truth concerning the impacts of CAFOs on rural communities is based on research from a wide variety of sources and his experiences in rural communities, listening to arguments presented by those on both sides of this controversial issue. Dr. Ikerd is the author of 5 books: Sustainable Capitalism, A Return to Common Sense, Small Farms Are Real Farms, Crisis and Opportunity, Sustainability in American Agriculture, and Essentials of Economic Sustainability. In back, I have his book, Small Farms Are Real Farms. I've only made it through the first few chapters, but it's excellent, so I would recommend that to you. The title of Dr. Ikerd's presentation tonight is Community Impacts of Industrial Animal Agriculture. Please welcome Dr. John Ikerd.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you tonight. As I told some people earlier this afternoon, usually this is one of the least favorite things I do is when I go to places and talk about large-scale confinement animal feeding operations, because it's communities that are in trouble and being threatened by new hog operations or new dairy operations or whatever opening in their community. It's a little bit of a relief tonight to know that you folks have risen up confronted the packing house issue, and at least for the time being, that you're in a position where you said, no, we don't want it here, and they're looking around elsewhere. Some people said, well, don't get too comfortable in that position because they may be back, they may or may not, but at least you have a little bit of a respite, and I want to congratulate the people in the community on educating yourself and making a decision about what you want for the future of your community. First asked me if I'd come up here tonight. I said I would come up here, but I really wanted Don Stull on the program because I've worked with Don on various places, and Don is really the expert on packing houses. And I know a little bit about packing houses. I used to work for Wilson Foods out of Kansas City when it was the 4th largest meat packer in the country. But Don has all the statistics and the real expert, and I think he made an excellent presentation tonight. So I want to focus my comments on some of the more general aspects of what happens with industrial agriculture in general and these large meat packing plants that we're seeing going up around the country today, and the large confined and animal feeding operations are the epitome of industrial agriculture. I want to start by saying that I care about rural America. I care about rural communities. I grew up on a small dairy farm, and I spent my whole professional career working with farmers and working with people in rural communities all around the country. And when I retired from the University of Missouri in Columbia, which is a college town, when it grew to 100,000 people and everybody from everywhere with all the franchised restaurants and motels started moving in, my wife and I decided that we wanted to move to a smaller community. And so we moved from Columbia to Fairfield, Iowa, which is a town of less than 10,000 people. You see, I hold a fondness for rural communities, but I have seen what happens to rural communities and what's happened over the last 30 or 40 or 50 years, really, that I've observed it. And I could see the communities in North Carolina, Oklahoma, and Georgia with the industrialization of agriculture there, and those communities in decay and decline. And when I came back to Missouri, and I had hoped to find some of the viable rural communities there that were there when I had left Missouri some 20 years before, but most of those rural communities in Missouri were also in decline and decay. Particularly during the 1980s, we had seen the communities in North Missouri, some of them in a decade, lost a third to a half of their population because of what was happening in agriculture at that particular point in time. But I'd had some contact in Iowa, and I knew that there were still many viable, vibrant rural communities. When I talk about rural communities, I'm talking about basically a non-metropolitan area. I would include, Mason City and Fairfield in their communities as well. And so I saw many of the viable rural communities that were still good places to live, and the houses were in good repair, and the main streets were open, and the square was still busy, and things of that nature. And so I thought Iowa would be a good place to come, because, you see, Iowa had held out for a long time against industrial agriculture. They wouldn't let the large confinement animal feeding operations come in here when they were exploding in North Carolina. But whenever Premium Standard Farms, the big packer, moved in with the CAFOs and the packing house in North Missouri, I guess the Iowans thought they were going to lose their rank in pork production, and so they opened the doors and welcomed them, and they come in. But you still have a lot of viable rural communities that are good places to live and good places to visit. And I think there's hope for rural communities today to regain and restore the status that they once had as most desirable places to live in the country. But I think that hope comes from an understanding of what the industrialization of agriculture has done to our rural communities across this country, what it is doing today, and what it's going to continue to do unless we demand fundamental change. And I want to say, what I say tonight is my truth. It's what I see, and it's up to you to decide what kind of future you want. But I think in deciding what kind of future you want for your communities, you need to understand the realities of why the communities are in the situation that they are today. If you go back and you look historically, when the European settlers come to this country and they looked out across the country, they settled areas like here and on west and all across the country. They were looking for means of extracting the wealth from the resources of the country. Now, the Native Americans were already using the land and using the resources, but a very different way. So the Europeans had something different. And so we saw people scatter out across the country in relation to the natural resources that were there. And we saw communities spring up in relation to the people that were working the land. And some of the towns were logging towns, and some of the towns were mining towns, but many of the towns, particularly in the Midwest, turned out to be farming towns. Because the most valuable resource out here was not the timber and not the minerals, but it was the soil. And the ability of this soil to produce food for people, not just in this area, but all across. And when we began to produce, the settlers produced more than they needed for their families and started trading, then we had the economic communities come up, but they were still supported by the extraction of wealth from the land by the farmers out here. And farming was a way of making a living, but it was much more than that. It was a way of life. I make money out here, but it's about being a member of a community and a place to raise a family. And it was about being a caretaker and a steward of the land. And making a living, the economic part was just a means to doing that. And it remained much that way, and much of the desirability of living in rural areas came from that idea that it wasn't just about money, it was about a desirable quality of life. And it remained that way up until the 1950s. Farming was more than just a business. But the technologies that came out of World War II, the technologies that led to the chemical fertilizers and the pesticides and the mechanization of agriculture, fundamentally changed agriculture from a way of life into a bottom line business. It's changed it from being farming to being farming as a way of life, and farming as a member of community and a caretaker of the land, to farming as a bottom line industry. You see, a lot of people think about industrialization and they think about the transition from an agrarian society to people moving into the cities, into the factories. And industrialization is really a way of thinking about organizing resources, a way of doing things. And it's characterized by specialization, standardization, and consolidation of control. And whenever we had the fertilizers then, the chemical fertilizers that came out of the munitions plants, particularly nitrogen fertilizer, then it allowed farmers to specialize, to move away from crop rotations. With the chemical pesticides, we could standardize, we could control the pest, and we could regulate the growth processes. And then we could standardize, then we simplified and routinized, and then we could mechanize with the tractors that were built out of plants that had once produced tanks. Once you standardize and specialize and standardize, then you can consolidate control into larger and larger operations. And that's what we saw in industry when you go to the larger factories instead of the craftsmen, and that's what we saw in agriculture with the consolidation into larger and larger farming operations. And we achieved the economic efficiency in the process of making agriculture more efficient, producing more with fewer people and from the same amount of land. But in the process, we transformed farming from a way of life to just another bottom line business. And we see the negative consequences of that. The consequences are inevitable. We see them in other industries, but we see them also in agriculture. We see the negative environmental and social consequences. And those consequences are inevitable because agriculture doesn't fit this industrial model. Agriculture is a living biological process. It's inherently diverse, the plants, the animals, and if you have a healthy system that has diversity, it's individualistic, it's not standardized. Everything is different in any particular location, and every farmer and farm family is different. And the relationships are interdependent, mutually beneficial, not dominating, not controlling. And when we see an industrial model applied to something that's biological, the living systems, we see the consequences in the erosion of the soil from the large-scale mechanization as we went out across the country and plowed up the prairie and plowed up the land. And we see the pollution of the air and water with agricultural chemicals and the biological waste from the animal feeding operations. We see the depletion of the aquifers and the depletion of the natural productivity of the soil. And all of these are the consequences of this specialized monocropping, corn, soybeans, large-scale hogs, chickens, dairy, whatever it is. We've turned our farms into factories without rules, and our fields and feedlots into biological assembly lines, and nature is fighting back against that. We see the social and economic consequences as well. Because we see fewer people on the farms today because that specialization, standardization, consolidation, it means that you can produce more with less. In fact, that's what gains the economic efficiency of industrialization, is that you're able to de-skill the work so that you can do it with less skilled workers, and you replace the workers all you can with machines. And then you have fewer people making the decisions. And so as a natural consequence of industrialization, you're going to employ fewer people, and the people you employ are going to earn less. You heard it in the packing plants, but you see it on industrial agriculture as well. And you can pay the people less because they're doing less skilled work. And as a consequence of that, the statistics are there for the things that I talked about here. Between 1950 and 1970, we lost half of our farmers. We displaced our farmers in the country by industrialization of agriculture. And during the farm financial crisis of 1980, we lost another fourth of our farmers out here. And then we see the economic consequences, but also the community, consequences on the social life in the community. Because, it's not just production that supports rural economies, it takes people. It takes people to not just buy feed and fertilizer and farm equipment, but people to shop on Main Street to buy the clothes and the cars and the shoes and the other things that support the businesses in rural communities. And it also takes people to support a community. It takes people so that you have children in the schools so that the schools will stay open. And it takes people to serve on the volunteer fire department and in the city council. And it takes people to go to churches so the churches are open. And so when we depopulated rural communities, then we destroyed not only the economic, but the social cultures of the communities as well. And many of our once agricultural communities, and they turn to recruiting industry. And that's what the packing plants are about, and that's what other kind of industry is about. But you know what? Industry is, again, run by the economic bottom line. They're simply looking for some place they can exploit either the natural resources or the human resources, meaning people that will work hard for less than wherever they're leaving and coming to your community. And when they find someone else somewhere who will work harder for even less, or some other community that will pay them more than you paid them to bring them to your community, then they pack up and leave the community in decline and decay. And we see communities then out across the country. If you have going to build a new prison, people compete. You know, communities will put together proposals so they can get a prison because they want jobs, almost any kind of jobs. And if you don't get a prison, then you can probably get a landfill, because there's always some urban area looking for some place to dump your trash, or a toxic waste incinerator, or up in North Dakota, someplace to bury nuclear waste. There's a lot of demand for that kind of thing. And that's rural economic development, as they talk about today. And if you miss out on everything else, then you can always get somebody to build you a giant confined animal feeding operation and dump their manure in your backyard. This is the consequences of industrialization of agriculture. Our rural communities have been left with places without purpose. It's not necessarily the fault of the people. I argue that it's a lot of good people that are caught up in a bad system. And the system is increasingly controlled by multinational large shareholder corporations that have no capacity for social and economic or ethical values. It's all about the economic bottom line. And that's what's controlling agriculture, and that's what's increasingly controlling our society overall. It's time to stop and think. It's time to stop and think like I did. I was forced to back in the 1980s. I spent the first half of my 30-year academic career promoting industrialization of agriculture. We were going to make good food affordable to everyone. And I realized that some people were going to leave rural communities, but I thought they were going to find better paying jobs and a better quality of life elsewhere. But we were going to make good food affordable to everybody. It's going to be good for the farmers, good for the communities, and everybody. But it didn't work. It was a grand, noble experiment, but it didn't work. It failed. It failed for those farmers that were driven out of business because they didn't want to leave to go anywhere else, and there wasn't any good place for them to go anyway. It didn't work for the communities that were in decline and decay and destroyed and boarded up as a consequence of industrial agriculture. And it isn't working for those of future generations that are going to depend upon having healthy, productive soils and a natural environment so they can produce their own food. And in addition to that, it didn't even do what we set out to do. It didn't produce good food for everyone. In fact, we have a higher rate of food insecurity or hunger in this country today than we did back in the 1960s before all of this started. When CBS did the program in '67 called Hunger in America, it was estimated about 5% of the people in this country were hunger or food insecure. The latest reports, almost 15% of the people now don't have enough food to know that they're going to be in a situation where they don't know if they're going to have enough food to get them through the end of the month. And more than 20% of our children live in food insecure homes. You can't feed the hungry simply by trying to make agriculture more efficient and making food cheap. And in addition to that, particularly the lower income people, the food that they can afford to eat is making them sick. We've got an epidemic of obesity and diabetes and high blood pressure and heart disease and a whole range of cancers that are associated to the so-called American diet, which begins with industrial agriculture. It was well-intentioned, it didn't work. And a growing number of people are beginning to understand and realize that there's something fundamentally wrong with the food system. And you have people raising questions and raising issues about it all across the country. In response to these growing public concerns, what's industrial agriculture doing? Are they changing? Are they responding? No, they simply put together a giant public relations program or propaganda program, if you will. And the stated purpose of that overall program, as they talk about it, is to increase confidence and trust among the American consumers in so-called modern food systems. They wouldn't be spending millions of dollars, roughly $25 million for more than a dozen kind of PR groups that are out there today. Spending trying to convince us that industrial agriculture is no different from the traditional family farm and that we should continue to support it. If you want to go look this up, the Food Dialogues is one of the bigger ones by the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance, and it's funded by and supported by, and the board of directors are large corporations, but in addition to large commodity organizations, and the American Farm Bureau Federation is one of the supporters of it. Monsanto and DuPont have each pledged $500,000 or $500,000 a year to support it. And what they have is a program where they talk about the faces of farmers and ranchers, and they show the young farmers and ranchers that are out on the fields and talking about how they care for the land and they care for the animals. And I'm sure these are good people, but they're simply trying to put a pretty face on the increasingly ugly business of industrial agriculture. And part of what they talk about, they said, we've concluded that science or information just doesn't convince people anymore that everything is all right. And so we've got to turn to emotional appeals, is what they say. You know, for decades they called for sound science. They called the critics of industrial agriculture the people that were emotional and uninformed. But now that the science is mounting against them, then they've decided, well, we're going to go to public relations rather than deal with the science. And the reason they're doing that is the science is indicting them. And the scientific evidence is mounting against them every day. I've gone to just quoting what I call the meta reports that go with a lot of different reports and scientific information that they put together. But one of those in 2008 was put together by the Pew Charitable Trust, which is a highly respected institution, and they studied what they called industrial farm animal production. They spent 2.5 years. They had a former Secretary of Agriculture, a lot of people from academia, but also people from farming and ranching and public institutions on it. And the conclusion they come up with is they said that the current industrial farm animal production system often poses unacceptable risk to public health, the environment, and the welfare of animals themselves. That was their basic summary conclusion, and it's on the internet. You can go download the conclusion. They cited over 180 different references that they had come to, or studies that they had reviewed the period of time. They said the negative effects of this IFAP system, this industrial animal production or CAFO system, they said the negative effects of this system are too great and the scientific evidence is too strong to ignore. Significant changes must be implemented and must start now. That was 2008. 5 years later, 2013, Johns Hopkins School of Public Health assembled a group of people, and they went through and they examined all the recommendations that had been made, the changes they said must start now. They concluded that basically nothing positive had been done in terms of public policy or in terms of voluntary compliance relative to those concerns after 5 years. Relying on voluntary compliance and people being good stewards and being like family farmers once were simply has not worked. The science of indictment is out there, and you can quote more and more, but I'm just going to hit the high points, and I did develop a paper that's available where I provide the references for here, but with respect to water quality, for example. The PR says that farmers are good stewards of the land and water and so on, and they may try to be, but they're caught in a bad system again. In the late 1990s, the continuous violations of the CAFOs were causing people in EPA. EPA was preparing a lawsuit against the big contract corporations or CAFO corporations. They went out and did a survey across the country. They identified 35,000 miles of streams in 17 states that had been polluted by CAFOs. The groundwater in 22 states had been polluted as well. Well, that was in the 1990s, but they were getting ready. They had a change in administration. They dropped the lawsuit. They decided we'll let the CAFOs monitor themselves. We'll have voluntary compliance with best management practices. So we haven't done studies like that since. They say, well, at least we're better than the independent hog farmers were. But if that's the case, why have we had a tripling, a threefold increase in impaired or polluted waters in the state of Iowa between 2002 and 2013 when we were building CAFOs and displacing our independent hog farmers as fast as we could? And there's been another 15% increase since then. You know, there's reason for public concern about these operations. This is not just an environmental tree hugger kind of thing. It's not just about the snails or the fish that die. This is a public health risk. If you've got 5,000 hogs out here, you have basically the same biological waste and the public health risk associated with that as you have a municipality of 15 to 20,000 people. That's the reason if you have 15 to 20,000 people, you have to have a multi-stage waste disposal system. You can't just go out and spread the sewage out on people's backyards. When you're talking about this Prestige operation coming in, packing house up here, if they had 3 million additional hogs, they were talking about going to 6 million. 3 million hogs is equivalent to about 10 million people. That's 3 times the total population of Iowa. And you're going to spread the manure, the sewage, out here in the country, right around your city. It's 15 times as much as the city of Des Moines. And it's not just nitrogen and phosphate in there. There's all kinds of biological organisms and hormones and antibiotics and a whole range of things that come out with the manure out of these operations today. When we talk about odors, they say, well, that's just typical farm odors, but it's not. This is fundamentally different, folks. You have this manure putrefying in these pits in an anaerobic or without oxygen that's fundamentally different than when you have animals out here on the land and whenever it's decomposing in an oxygen environment. You end up with things like, particularly with emissions of ammonia and hydrogen sulfide and methane, which have been shown by study after study to cause respiratory problems, particularly in children, and there's some associated with schools and older people. And then you also have the phosphorus and nitrogen, and these are basic public health risks. And I think one of the most significant ones is you have antibiotic resistant bacteria that are developing in these operations. It creates an ideal breeding ground for antibiotic resistance. There was a GAO, a Government Accounting Office report, major report with a number of scientists, 2004, basically indicted the industry. The industry come back and said, oh, it's not conclusive, it's being transferred to humans. But there's a recent report that came out about 2 years ago, I think it was 2013, by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and I'll quote from that. It says that scientists around the world have provided strong evidence that antibiotic use in food-producing animals can harm public health. Use of antibiotics in food-producing animals allows antibiotic-resistant bacteria to thrive while susceptible bacteria are suppressed or die. Resistant bacteria can be transmitted from food-producing animals to humans through the food supply. That's what the scientists can do. This is a major health risk. I was in the UK. UK has declared antibiotic resistance for organisms like MRSA, which now kills more people in AIDS than others, as a major health emergency that must be addressed there. And yet we're in denial. We've known about this problem at least since 1980, and we continue to be in denial about it being associated with animal feeding operations. When we look at the quality of life, people say, well, you just have to put up with it. It's going to have to diminish quality of life in rural communities because it's necessary for the agricultural economy. And particularly in Iowa, what the tendency is to say, well, this is an agricultural state. You just have to put up with agriculture. Did you know that agriculture only accounts for about 7% of the Iowa GDP, or gross national output, or gross domestic output? It's important to the state, but it's not so important that you have to compromise or sacrifice everything just so that Iowa can continue to have its rank in terms of agriculture. And besides that, as Don mentioned out here, this isn't just about production. What we're talking about is about people. And we have 50 years of history now, more than 50 years of history with CAFOs, and we know what happens in terms of the employment of people in these industries as you go from the independent family farms to CAFOs. We have virtually no independent chicken producers left. They're all in CAFOs. They started first. Then came beef. Approximately 90% of the beef, more than 90 and 95% of the beef and pork today is produced under contract in the large confinement animal feeding operations. And more than 90% of our beef producers have been forced out of business, our beef feeders. We still have a lot of cow-calf operators. We saw the same thing in pork production. As we moved from the independent hog farmers to the large confinement animal feeding operations, we lost 90% of our hog farmers as well. We've lost about 80% of our dairy farmers, and we'll lose the rest of those as well. This is what's happened to rural communities. This is what happens to employment. This is a natural consequence of industrialization because the economies of scale come from displacing people and replacing them. Again, there's a 2008 Pew report that had a summary that goes all across the board, and they surveyed, much like Don was talking about in packing house towns, and they found that wherever you have industrial agriculture, you see increasing inequity in income and opportunity, increasing poverty within the communities. You see declining businesses on Main Street, fewer stores, fewer opportunities. You know, the North Dakota Attorney General's office came out with another report when they were trying to defend their corporate farming law. They reviewed 56 studies and said inevitably you see decline in the quality of life whenever you go to large-scale industrial agriculture operations. So where's the hope for rural Iowa? Where's the hope for rural communities across the country? The hope is that people will awaken. That we'll awaken and we'll demand something fundamentally changed. We said we had enough of this and we're not going to take it anymore. There's a lady by the name of Margaret Wheatley, which is one of the leading kind of thought people in the kind of the whole idea of change and preparing for change and organizing industry, organizing business and communities for change. And she went away on a retreat a while back and came back and said she had three basic conclusions that I thought were very insightful and I think may be useful to us. She said the first conclusion was that she saw an increase in the attitude of kind of impotence and dread among people all across the country. If people know that something is not going in the right direction and they don't think that life is getting better and they're losing confidence in the future. I think we see this in society in general, but I think we see it particularly in our rural communities. The second thing she says that she concluded that information just simply doesn't change people's minds. And she was talking about global climate change and fossil energy depletion and a few other things like that. And she says, you know, the information, we can put together all the information that doesn't necessarily change people's mind. And I think it's the kind of information that we have these days that's hard to change people's mind. The third thing is, I think she said that's most important. She says that she come to the conclusion that local communities are the key to change. When local communities take action, that's what brings about change. That's what always has, and she says always will. She says there is no greater power for change or transformation than when communities take charge of their own destiny. Now I see the kind of the impotence and dread in rural communities. Fred Kurtzman down at the Leopold Center at Iowa State University, he quoted a 91 study where he says that they did a study all across the country and they went out and interviewed rural people and they said they found two attitudes in rural communities at that time. They said one is that rural communities are people in rural communities are convinced that their community is going to die and there's nothing they can do about it. Death is certain. And he said the other one is that people think that their community is going to die, but they still have hope that they can somehow go out and recruit an industry to come in and save them. Whether it's a packing plant or whether it's a toxic waste incinerator or whatever it is. It's probably the industry recruiting sort of thing that we have out here. And so I think we see those same things in rural communities, and I think we see communities that are desperate for jobs, and those are the ones that are still hanging on to hope. I think we also see the second point, the information. You know, that information doesn't really change minds because the information I've talked about is out there. It's documented. USDA, the public health studies, the large public health institutions all across. In fact, there was a recent report that just came out where they were studying the food system, industrial food system overall. It's the International Panel of Experts, again, over 300 different citations they have. They say, today's food and farming systems have succeeded in supplying large volumes of food to global markets, but are generating negative outcomes on multiple fronts. Widespread degradation of land, water, and ecosystems, high greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity losses, persistent hunger and micronutrient deficiencies alongside the rapid rise in obesity and diet-related diseases, and livelihood stresses for farmers all around the world. That was their conclusion based on the bottom report. So where is the hope here? And they come around and said that the scientific information in diet and industrial agriculture is overwhelming. So where's the hope here if information won't change minds? Well, I think the hope is that most people still don't have access to the information. The change comes from people standing up and telling the truth, and whenever you convince people and when you have a consensus of the people for change, which I think we're building up to, then I think change can change. Information can change minds. And I think regardless of whether we believe information will change minds or it will not, we have a responsibility to educate ourselves on the issues, not just listen to any particular expert, but to educate ourselves on the issues and stand up and speak our truth wherever we are. I may be idealistic, but I'm convinced that the truth ultimately will prevail, and if we tell the truth loud enough, long enough, in enough places, then the consensus for public change will come, and we will find change in the political process and in policies, and change in our societies, and change in our rural communities. And finally, I'll close with this. I agree completely. There is no greater power anywhere for change than communities stand up and take the future in their own hands. How do we do that? I think the things we do in rural areas in particular, we focus on those broad areas of public concern, on issues of public health and animal welfare and general environmental issues and food safety, things that affect us in rural areas but also affect people in urban areas as well. So it's the broad environmental concerns, I think particularly public health. I think we need to build coalitions with other communities and other people in other areas. There's an Iowa Alliance for Responsible Agriculture. Now we have over 30 groups, and more than half of them are local groups that are formed in communities like yours where people rose up in opposition, and we're building a coalition, and we're calling and demanding for stronger regulations of CAFOs. They should be regulated just like any other industry because that's what they are. And if they can't regulate them, we need a moratorium on them until they can figure out what they're doing. I think the most important positive thing that's coming out of everything that's going on here is we're developing the leadership, the future leadership of rural communities and possibly of our society as a whole among people that are taking the future in their own hands and rising up and getting involved in the political process and saying, we don't have to take it anymore. We need to promote the alternatives. The alternatives are out there, organic and biological agriculture and holistic and free-range, antibiotic-free, welfare-approved, a whole range of things. And the growing markets for them, consumers want them. There are alternatives out there. The report I talked about on the international area, agroecology, permaculture, nature farming, these have the opportunity of doubling and tripling agriculture production all around the country, all around the world without industrial agriculture. The alternate food systems today only amount to about 10% of the overall market, but we're growing in other areas beyond the farmers markets and CSAs. I recently found out about two organizations called HelloFresh and Blue Aprons, which deliver sustainably grown food from hormone antibiotic-free, organic, biological things into the cities. And they have, or each of them has 8 to 10 million customers, 8 to 10 million deliveries a month now that they're making. That's over 300,000 customers each. So we have opportunities to reach the market, to bypass the industrial food system and go directly to the consumer. We have the power to change public policies, and when we change public policies, we can create something different. Industrial agriculture didn't happen by itself. Every public policy that I can think of, major public policy, has been promoting industrialization. When we promote the alternative, we rise up and say we want something different, we will get it. Much has been lost. We can't get back what was lost, but there's still a lot of good places to live out here. There's still a lot of rural communities out here, I suspect including yours, that still has clean air and clean water, and still has friendly people, and still has a sense of community and a caring, and still has a commitment to try to create a place where your children and your children's children will choose to live and grow. There's places like Mason City and places like Fairfield and other places within Iowa that I think when we come to a life and when we take charge of our own future, we can create a fundamentally better future for ourselves and for those of future generations. But we have to reject the industrial model of agriculture, embrace the quality of life, and the only way we can do that is through the power of community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ikerd. Greatly appreciate that. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we'll now take a 15-minute break. There are refreshments in the back for you. And then when we come back, we'll begin the question and answer portion of the program, which we've allotted a lot of time for. So we'll see you back in 15 minutes. Thank you.